We created a culture in this country, and it was transmitted from generation to generation for quite a long period of time, hundreds of years.
Right.
Still is, but we're seeing breaks. So what would you identify as some of the key features of our culture created here that have roots in Africa? What would you see as some of the key features of that culture that gave us the strength to deal with a lot of these forces that try and re-socialize us?
Right. A lot of our ability to self-socialize as a group occurs after slavery, after 1865. From the 1500s to 1865, we're controlled both physically and psychologically by another group of persons, even when we were considered to be free, and had very little control over how we do what we did. So we had to fit into something else. After 1865, we began to try and reconstruct ourselves. And we used multiple institutions to do it. One of them was the Prince Hall Mason institutional structure. One of them, the major pieces, was the church. We were not big in Christianity before 1865. It is the myth about the conversion of Black people to Christianity during slavery. That's the last thing they wanted to do. Is after slavery, when the church became the only institutional sanctuary we were allowed to construct, that we constructed in such a massive way to carry out the intergenerational socialization of our children. At this point, we are the primary teachers or we carried out the primary apprenticeship programs that allow the next generation to survive, to gain the tools to survive into the future. Right now, we can't do that. Right now, it's the school system and the university system that is poised to give the tools so that a young person can see themselves and see their survival into the future. And that has brought about crisis because those who control the instrument that we call the school system and the system of higher education control it to our demise. The average young Black man or woman in the street involved in what you're calling crime, especially that harsh element that is involved into taking of life, that's an unemployed and unemployable population with a sense of hopelessness, okay? With a sense of no future possibilities. So there's an anger and a bitterness there. And that anger and bitterness is first centered on the elder generation of Black people who they felt did not make a way for them, to keep them from sinking into that hopelessness of not being able to provide the primal motive force for living: food, clothing, shelter, safety for a person and a family. And when we have this discussion, and I know people discussing violence in the street and so forth, and there's no discussion about employability of human beings that are committing this violence and the need for employability to provide the most fundamental and basic: food, clothing, shelter, and safety. And when a man or a woman can't do that, they'll turn to whatever means there is that would allow them to acquire at least the minimum of that. And that's always crime. And then you have an institution that have calculated, deny education, deny training, deny tooling, you force them into crime. We have a prison industrial complex that will then take and reprocess them and recycle them over and over in that antisocial negative behavior that will constantly destabilize the Black community wherever it's at. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd like to deal with that as well. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And so your point that our real socialization under our control starts with the end of enslavement. And I think that's true. But the culture itself was created during enslavement. And
Right.
what's interesting is Zora Neale Hurston, she made the comment, and I think it was very perceptive on her part, raised in an all-Black community. She said, the closer we were to slavery, the more African we were. And so at your point about an enslavement, we didn't take on Christianity. It was a fraction of Blacks who did for a lot of reasons. Basically, we saw it as evil in that the practitioners of it, the most serious practitioners of slavery were Christians, Christian slave masters. And plus, we viewed, the whole connection with God as a spirit thing. And so you respected when someone manifested godlike behavior. And so they had a term in slavery called him-be. And so the term was, whatever your belief was, you him-be. And so they didn't see him-be being godlike. They saw him-be as the devil. And the nation didn't start calling them devils, enslaved Africans did. So the Hush Harbor, all those places we put a head under a bucket and whatnot and brought down the spirit, all of this under the leadership of voodoo priests who were the healers and the diviners on the plantation. So your point that when we get out of enslavement, and we're still fighting, because now we got this period where we're fighting during Reconstruction, and then that's betrayed with post-Reconstruction. We're put back into picking cotton, slavery of society, but still we have a measure of freedom. And Black men are fighting to see they maintain control of their families and women. And as much as possible, they don't want them working for white people. Some can't, some don't have any say so because of the nature of poverty. But the key point you make is, coming out of enslavement, we use secret societies to build a lot of Black communities. And those were secret societies operating during slavery. The Loyal League was one of the biggest ones. And the Masons, as you point out, that was a major institution that we hid our African secret society in, but then we created secret societies that had no affiliation with formal secret society orders coming from whites. And the ones we got from whites, they operated as African secret societies, taking care of the community and stuff. It wasn't about
the Knights of Pythias, the Odd Fellows, the Daughters of Ruth, the Daughters of Isis, the Daughters of Tent. Many of the youngsters never heard of these organizations. Yet these were the burial society, the benevolent society. And these became the educational modem for continuing education in the Black community, where you learn bookkeeping, carpentry, masonry, plumbing, nursing. We didn't get those skills from the white universities. We got it from these fraternities and sororities. And this is post-college fraternities and sororities.
Yeah, and some of the largest ones had no affiliation with the Masons and Elks. They were independently organized, but the ones that did, they were independently organized as well.
But what was unique, but when you study them, you will find that the same persons belong to both.
Yeah.
So the guy in Prince Hall also belonged to these other benevolent societies. And the woman in the Eastern Star belonged to the other benevolent societies. So they were the kind of like crossover and relationship based on affiliation.
So our approach to building community was very African, because the secret society in Africa, those were the institutions created when enslavement and colonialism hit Africa. And so Africans go into the bush, and their elders began to use this as the place where you're initiating young boys and girls into manhood and womanhood, but you're teaching everything, which is the warrior societies, Perang, which is the highest educational system in Kemet, House of Life, their highest university, that came out of the secret societies of Africa. But Perant did not train warriors, but secret societies in Africa train warriors. So another key thing, when you see Blacks, 170,000 in the Civil War fighting, they tip the balance and win the Civil War. Well, there's a fighting tradition that they have, a warrior, and it's all over the Western Hemisphere, because the initiation into those societies was rough and tough, both for sisters and brothers. Some actually died, but they actually meant you die as a child, be reborn as an adult, and be reborn as a man or woman. So those institutions were really key. And your point about burial societies, that became the basis for insurance companies, $100 million insurance companies. I was speaking in LA years ago on Malcolm X, and there was a brother there whose father was a founder of one of the largest Black insurance companies in the United States. And the way in which that insurance company was founded was very African. He had a dream, and in his dream, he created the secret society, just like Nat Turner had dreams, and in his dreams, he launched a slave rebellion, the most successful in terms of taking out whites. Denmark Vesey is the most successful in terms of being well organized. So that point of secret society is important. And your point about the church, I've discussed this with you before, and I'm just throwing this out as a general thing, but there were two efforts to subvert Christianity. One failed, one succeeded. The Irish tried to subvert Christianity. They were the first colonial project of the British. Before they colonized Africa anywhere else, they chopped off Irish heads. They scalped the Irish, and they sent the Scots-Irish into Ulster to do that. And on condition of they kill off the Irish, they could get Ulster. And then they became the major killers in the wars of genocide that this country carried out in the United States. So they were the training ground, but the Irish were the first civilized group that comes out after the collapse of the Roman Empire, heavily influenced by Kemetic civilization. And so they try to pull off their version of Christianity that's very spirit-based. But what happened is the Roman Catholic Church and the King of England ganged up on them and stopped that. But what most Blacks don't know, and I'm just throwing this out right now, you already know this, but most Blacks don't know. Blacks, the only ones that actually went inside this Black church, this white church, so-called Christianity, and subverted it. And what they did is they dropped voodoo, which is their whole culture. They didn't just put what people call religion, because it wasn't religion, it was spirit-based practices, but it was total. And they dropped that in to what they called the Black church. And the first leaders of this, Du Bois had an intuition on this. He said that the diviners were, the natural leaders, the healer of the sick, the comforter of the sorrowful. But he also said they were the founders of the Black church. And most scholars have rejected that because they haven't seen the evidence. I got the evidence. Many of these first preachers were actually diviners. You know what I mean? Not all of them, but many of them. So that what you have inside the Black church is some very African stuff that has been the source of beauty in our culture. I mean, where do you get good singers? Where do you get good speakers? Where do you get good leaders? So that was a key part. Now, your point on apprenticeship, that's real key. Because enslavement, if you look at the Caribbean, it's very clear that the enslaved Africans in the Caribbean, when slavery is over, they come into colonialism, and then they get their independence in the 50s, 60s. Their skilled people are all trained by their own people, and they're coming up under apprenticeship. And the same with us. And so the apprenticeship systems, John Henry Clark, I'm doing a book on mastery, SEBA, which is our system for teaching. John Henry Clark, a high school education, one of the best scholars we've ever had. He apprenticed under masters, William Leo Hansberry being the most important of many masters, Mm-hmm. And Malcolm X, he apprenticed under masters. Paul Robeson being the most important master. We often think of Elijah Muhammad. He had influence, but Paul Robeson's influence precedes Elijah's in prison. And it had a great influence because it was political, whereas Elijah's was more spiritual, and they were both important. But this whole point of apprenticeship, where you're looking to elders who are masters to provide guides for you, that system still exists, but it's much weaker, as you point out, because of the intrusion, not just of public schools, but now, in the case of jazz schools, you know, where now it's not being taught as you're living under a master and learning from a master and undergoing transformation. Now you're learning the mechanics of music. And then the music changes with that. But this system of apprenticeship is still there. And your point about unemployment, that major cause for gang activity is, it used to be if you were in a gang, after 20 or so, you're out, you got a job, you're raising a family. Now there's no jobs. And so as a result, gangs become families for life. And, you know, your point about the attack on elders, the institution of elderhood was one of the key things we carried in slavery, from Africa, and out of slavery. And one of the reasons why we made good decisions is that elders were there that we were listening to. Now, not only for the gangsters who are out there shooting people, but for a lot of younger people, they're listening to their peer group as the one that's giving them advice. And there's a guy that works out with me at the Y, he's blind now. He used to be gangbanging and stuff, and then he got wise. And he said, today, common sense isn't so common. And so we've now got brothers and sisters who don't want to take a shot because of what happened to us with the Tuskegee experiment. And I understand their reason, but people are not dying from taking shots. They're dying from not taking them. And of course, they were dying before you had shot.
And that's saying that people who misunderstood what happened at Tuskegee, they didn't die from taking shots. They died from not having been given shots.
Well put.
Okay. And so, and that's why it's important to study history and not just get caught up in somebody else's mystery of your history. So